I used to believe that weddings were the pinnacle of love stories, that once you reached the altar, everything after would be happily ever after. That was before I learned that sometimes, the man waiting at the end of the aisle isn't your salvation. He's your executioner. In my first life, I was hours away from marrying Daniel Reed, the man I thought was the love of my life. The man who had swept me off my feet with charming words, grand gestures, and promises he whispered in the dark when it was just us. But beneath the tailored suits and practiced smile was a predator who dismantled my life piece by piece, so quietly I didn't realize it until I was standing in the ruins. My friends? Gone, alienated one by one through carefully planted lies. My family? Stripped of our business after Daniel maneuvered himself into control of our assets under the guise of protecting our future. My reputation? Shredded by whispers of infidelity and irresponsibility, rumors Daniel himself had started. I found out the truth only after the ceremony. I remember the moment like it's carved into my bones. Standing in the reception hall, still in my gown, champagne glass in hand, when Daniel took the microphone and, with that same charming smile, announced he would be filing for divorce. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Immediately. It's for the best, he told the crowd, his voice dripping with false regret. Claire and I, we just aren't compatible. And then he introduced his new partner, a woman I had once called a friend. The humiliation was so sharp, it cut deeper than the betrayal. My world tilted that day, and by nightfall, it ended entirely. The accident was quick, a flash of headlights, a screech of tires, the metallic crush of steel. But it wasn't until later that I realized it hadn't been an accident at all. Daniel had made sure I wouldn't live long enough to become a problem. Only, I did. Because when I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in a hospital. I wasn't even in the wreckage. I was in my old bedroom, the silk robe I'd worn the night before the wedding tied loosely at my waist. The air smelled like the same roses my mother had insisted on for the ceremony. My phone buzzed with messages from friends wishing me luck, from vendors confirming last-minute details. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The date on the phone screen was the one I couldn't forget, the day before my wedding. I pressed my palms to my face, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't dreaming. I had been given another chance. The images of my first life came flooding back in rapid flashes, the altar, the reception, the public humiliation, the cold satisfaction in Daniel's eyes, the crushing impact of the crash. My stomach twisted, but then a new feeling bloomed in its place. Not fear. Not grief. Power. I had 24 hours until I was meant to marry the man who destroyed me. 24 hours to rewrite everything. This time, I wouldn't be the one left standing at the altar, broken and stripped of dignity. This time, I would walk down that aisle with a secret smile, look him in the eyes, and be the one to say no. And when I left, I wouldn't just take my pride with me. I'd take everything he thought was his. The morning light streamed through the sheer curtains, the same way it had in my first life, but this time I didn't feel the urge to savor it. In my first life, I'd spent these hours rushing from one task to another, smiling for photos, saying yes to every demand while Daniel drifted in and out, too busy with business calls to spend the morning with me. Now I knew those calls were to the woman who would replace me before our wedding night was over. I sat on the edge of my bed and let the memories come, sharp and unflinching. I remembered how he had kissed my forehead that morning like he was doing me a favor. I remembered the way he'd slipped out to pick up cufflinks, only to return hours later with lipstick faintly smudged at the edge of his collar. I had been so blinded by love, or what I thought was love, that I had swallowed every excuse. But this time I wasn't swallowing anything. This time I was sharpening it into a blade. The first thing I did was call my father's old attorney. In my first life, Daniel had convinced me to sign several documents just to simplify things, claiming it was to protect our assets once we were married. Buried in those papers was the transfer of my family's controlling shares in our company to him. I had been too distracted to notice. Today, I made sure those shares were moved into a trust under my sole name, effective immediately. The attorney, an older man who had always liked me, didn't ask questions. He just said, "It'll be done by noon." One piece off the board. Next, I called a woman named Ellen Hart. Ellen had been an investigative journalist in my first life, one who'd published an exposé on Daniel's fraudulent business deals 3 years after our marriage imploded. By then, it had been too late for me to use her work. But now, I could hand her the story before the ink on the marriage license even existed. I didn't give her everything, not yet. Just enough to spark her interest. She agreed to meet me at a cafe later that afternoon. Between those calls, I kept up the facade. I attended my final dress fitting with my mother, smiling sweetly as the seamstress fussed over me. I accepted the caterer's call about the menu. I even answered Daniel's text, just 3 words, "Ready for tomorrow?" with a simple heart emoji. Let him think I was still the naive bride-to-be who would stand beside him while he gutted my life. The less he suspected, the better. By early afternoon, I was at the cafe with Ellen. I wore oversized sunglasses and a cream coat that made me blend in with the crowd. When she slid into the booth across from me, she looked curious but skeptical. "You said you have information on Daniel Reed?" she asked. "I have proof," I said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "Bank transfers. Fake invoices. And a list of people he's scammed, all verified. You'll want to check your sources, but I think you'll find they're all eager to talk." She studied me for a moment. "Why now?" I smiled faintly. "Because tomorrow, everyone who matters will be in one place. And when you publish this, it will be the final nail in the coffin of his reputation." Ellen didn't ask for more. She pocketed the drive and left with a nod. Step 2 was in motion. By the time I returned home, the sun was low in the sky. The rehearsal dinner was set to begin in an hour. I stood in front of my mirror in the deep green dress I'd chosen for the evening. In my first life, I had worn pale blue, Daniel's favorite color, because I thought it would make him smile. Now, I wore a shade that made my eyes look like shards of glass. When I arrived at the restaurant, Daniel greeted me with that same charming grin, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "You look stunning," he said. "Almost makes me forget how nervous you were last time I saw you." I tilted my head and smiled back. "This time, Daniel, you'll remember everything." He laughed, not realizing I meant every word. We dined, we toasted, we laughed at speeches, but beneath it all was a quiet, thrilling certainty. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be the bride who was left. I would be the woman who left him with nothing but the wreckage. The morning of my wedding arrived exactly as I remembered it. Sunlight spilling across the carpet, the faint sound of preparations drifting in from the garden below, and the steady hum of anticipation from the staff moving through the house. But unlike the first time, I didn't feel my chest tightening with nerves. I felt calm. Cold. Ready. In my first life, I had woken to a flurry of makeup artists and hairdressers, smiling guests dropping in to wish me luck, and Daniel's absence explained away by a text saying he was handling a last-minute issue. I had been so eager to believe everything was perfect that I never stopped to wonder what issue could possibly keep a groom from seeing his bride before the ceremony. Now, I knew the answer: he had been with her, the woman he'd chosen before the vows were even spoken. I let the morning unfold as if nothing had changed. The stylists worked on my hair while my mother fussed with the dress bag. My bridesmaids laughed and gossiped, unaware that they would soon witness something they'd talk about for years. I smiled when they made me pose for photos, holding the bouquet like I was holding on to a dream. All the while, I kept one eye on the clock. At precisely 10 o'clock, I slipped away to the study. My father's attorney had left a sealed envelope on the desk, confirmation that the trust had been finalized, the shares now untouchable by anyone but me. The weight of that paper in my hand felt heavier than the bouquet. I tucked it into my clutch. Step 1 was secure. Then came step 2. Ellen had been busy. She sent me a single text that morning: "It's ready." goes live at noon. Noon, just after the ceremony was meant to begin. I pictured the headlines spreading like wildfire across every screen in the reception hall, the guests scrolling through their phones in shock. Daniel would have no time to spin the story, no way to contain it. Perfect. At 11, I walked into the bridal suite where my gown hung waiting. Layers of ivory silk pulled across the floor, a vision of purity and grace. In my first life, I had cried when I put it on, overwhelmed by the moment. This time, I didn't cry. I slid into the dress like slipping into armor. The bodice fit snugly against my ribs, the skirt whispering with each step I took. I looked into the mirror and saw a bride, yes, but not the kind Daniel thought he owned. Downstairs, the guests were already seated. Music floated up from the quartet in the garden. I could hear the faint murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. My mother dabbed at her eyes as she adjusted my veil. "You're going to be so happy," she said softly. I only smiled. The wedding coordinator knocked and announced it was time. My father appeared at the door, offering his arm. In my first life, I had clung to it for support. Now, I took it with the easy poise of someone who knew exactly where she was walking, and why. As we stepped into the aisle, every head turned. The late morning light made the silk of my gown glow, the veil casting a soft shadow over my face. I saw Daniel standing at the altar, handsome in his black suit, every inch the charming groom. His eyes lit up when he saw me, or maybe they just reflected the pride he felt at putting on this show. I kept walking, each step slow and deliberate, my smile never faltering. Inside, my pulse was steady, my mind razor-sharp. I was not walking toward a promise. I was walking toward the perfect stage. When I reached the altar, Daniel took my hands. His grip was warm, his smile practiced. "You look incredible," he whispered. "Let's make this the best day of our lives." My own smile widened just enough for him to notice. "Oh, it will be," I said. The officiant began to speak, his words a blur of ceremonial phrases I'd heard before. My gaze stayed on Daniel's face, memorizing every flicker of confidence. The moment he handed me the perfect opening, I would take it. And when I finally said my piece, it wouldn't be "I do." The officiant's voice moved through the familiar script, each word a step closer to the moment I'd been waiting for. In my first life, I'd barely heard any of it. My head had been too full of hope, my heart pounding too loud to notice anything but Daniel's face. This time, I absorbed every word, not because I cared about the vows, but because I knew they would make the contrast of what came next even sharper. Around us, the guests leaned forward, eyes fixed on the picture-perfect couple they thought they knew. I could see my mother dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, my bridesmaids smiling through tears. Daniel's family sat proudly in the front row, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. I had timed it all down to the second. Ellen's article was set to publish at noon. It was 11:58. The officiant finished his preamble and looked at me, the cue for my vows. In my first life, I had poured my heart into them, speaking words I'd written in the small hours of the night, promising a forever that never came. Now, I took a breath, my smile calm and unshaken. "Before I say my vows," I began, my voice carrying easily over the hush that fell across the garden, "there's something I need to share." Daniel's smile faltered just slightly, his fingers tightening around mine. "This won't take long," I continued, keeping my tone light. "It's just, I can't marry a man who has built his life on lies." A ripple moved through the crowd. I could feel the confusion radiating off them, see heads turning toward one another. Daniel laughed under his breath, trying to turn it into a joke. "Claire, no," I said, loud enough to stop him cold. "You don't get to talk over me. Not this time." I slipped my hand from his grip and turned to face the guests. "The man you see standing here has spent years perfecting an image. The charming businessman. The loyal partner. But behind closed doors, he's stolen from his investors, sabotaged competitors, and betrayed every single person who ever trusted him, including me. Gasps erupted, a few voices muttering in disbelief. From the corner of my eye, I saw Daniel's jaw tighten, the first crack in his composure. I reached into my bouquet and pulled out my phone. "If you don't believe me," I said, holding it up, "check your notifications. By now, you'll find a detailed investigation from one of the most respected journalists in the city, complete with evidence of every crime he's committed." The crowd erupted into chaos. Guests scrambled for their phones, the quiet hum of curiosity replaced by sharp exclamations as they scrolled. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "What the hell are you doing?" I met his eyes, my smile sharp. "Ending something that never should have begun." The officiant was frozen in place, clearly unsure whether to intervene. My mother was pale, but I saw the flicker of realization in her expression, pieces of a puzzle she'd ignored for too long finally falling into place. "This is ridiculous," Daniel said, raising his voice to the guests. "She's unstable. This is some kind of stunt." "A stunt?" I cut in. "No, Daniel. A stunt would be marrying you and letting you think you'd won. This is justice." The clock on my phone turned to 12 o'clock. "Perfect." Ellen's headline flashed across the screen, "Daniel Reed exposed, fraud, infidelity, and the web of lies behind the smile." The words were now in everyone's hands, impossible to take back. I lowered my phone and turned back to him. "I won't be your victim again," I said quietly, so only he could hear. "And I won't waste another second standing beside you." Then, without another word, I stepped away from the altar, letting my train drag across the grass as I walked down the aisle alone. The guests parted in stunned silence, the only sound the frantic murmur of voices behind me. I didn't look back, not at Daniel, not at the life I'd just set on fire. This time, the ending was mine to write. The sound of my heels on the stone path felt louder than the murmurs of the guests behind me. Every step away from the altar sent a rush of heat through my chest, not from shame or fear, but from the sheer exhilaration of taking control. In my first life, I had been too stunned to move when Daniel humiliated me in public. I'd stood frozen, my heart in my throat, letting him dictate the story while the world watched. This time, I was already halfway to the gates before the officiant had even found the courage to speak again. The wedding planner scrambled after me, whispering something about reconsidering and not making a scene. I didn't slow down. The scene was the point. I wanted Daniel to feel every pair of eyes on him, to know that the carefully curated image he had built was unraveling thread by thread. At the edge of the garden, I stopped long enough to take a breath and glance back. The guests were on their feet, phones out, faces twisted in shock, curiosity, or barely contained delight. Daniel stood alone at the altar, flanked by groomsmen who looked like they were ready to disappear into the hedges. His mother was clutching his father's arm, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. The image was so perfect, I almost wished I had a photographer ready to frame it. Almost. I turned away before I could think too long about it and headed inside the estate. The reception hall had been set up for later, tables dressed in white linens, crystal glasses catching the light, a cake that probably cost more than some people's yearly rent. I walked straight to the head table and picked up a glass of champagne. It was still cold. I took a slow sip, savoring the crisp taste as if I were the one hosting the party. The catering staff avoided looking at me, clearly unsure whether to keep working or pretend they hadn't seen the bride walk in alone before the vows were done. My phone buzzed in my clutch. It was Ellen. It's everywhere. I opened the news feed, and she was right, article after article had already picked up her story. Screenshots of Daniel's emails, copies of bank statements, statements from former business partners who had nothing to lose by going public. The comments section was a battlefield, half the readers expressing shock, the other half claiming they had always suspected he was too good to be true. And in the middle of it all was a photo of Daniel from just last week, smiling that practiced smile that now looked almost pathetic. I sent Ellen a single reply, "Thank you." She responded instantly, "Remind me never to get on your bad side." By the time I looked up from my phone, I heard heavy footsteps approaching. Daniel stormed into the reception hall, his tie slightly askew, his expression twisted with barely controlled anger. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. I set my champagne down gently. "That," I said, "was the truth finally catching up to you." He stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "You think this little stunt is going to ruin me? You've embarrassed yourself more than you've embarrassed me. Everyone here will forget about this in a week." "You're right," I said, matching his calm. "They'll forget the wedding. But they won't forget the headlines. And the people who actually matter? They're already calling their lawyers." His jaw clenched. "You don't know what you've done." "Oh, I do," I said, smiling faintly. "I've done exactly what you taught me: strike first, leave nothing on the table, and never give your enemy a second chance." For a moment, I thought he might actually lose control and start shouting, but he didn't. He just gave me one last look, something between hatred and disbelief, and turned on his heel. I watched him go, noting the way his shoulders had stiffened, the way his steps were too fast, too sharp. He was rattled, and Daniel Reed hated being rattled. I picked up my champagne again and took another sip. The party I'd planned in my first life had ended in disaster for me. This time, it was just beginning, for him. By the time the guests started filtering out of the garden and into the reception hall, the air was heavy with whispers. People avoided looking directly at me, as if meeting my gaze might drag them into the scandal. A few had the nerve to approach, some out of concern, others out of morbid curiosity. One of Daniel's business associates, a man named Caldwell, came over with a glass of whiskey in hand. "Well," he said, glancing around like he expected to be overheard, "you certainly know how to make a statement." I met his eyes steadily. It wasn't a statement. It was the truth. He smirked faintly, nodding as if filing that away for later. "If you ever want to talk business, call me. I don't work with liars." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me with the strange satisfaction of knowing not everyone was here to pity me. Some were already shifting their loyalties. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Daniel moving through the crowd, his voice low but urgent as he tried to do damage control. He leaned in close to certain guests, gripping their arms a little too tightly, his expression an uneasy mix of charm and strain. I watched him like someone watching a sinking ship. Every time he thought he'd calmed a storm, someone else would glance at their phone, eyes widening at the article spreading through every feed in the city. His control was slipping, and for a man like Daniel, that loss was worse than any insult. My maid of honor, Jenna, approached cautiously. In my first life, she had been one of the friends Daniel pushed away from me, planting lies until she stopped returning my calls. Today, she looked at me with a mix of shock and something warmer, respect. "You knew?" she asked quietly. "This whole time?" "Not the first time," I admitted. "But I wasn't going to let it happen again." She shook her head, a smile tugging at her lips despite the chaos. "Remind me never to underestimate you." When she walked away, I let my gaze wander over the room one more time before stepping out into the side corridor. I needed a moment without the murmurs, without the flicker of screens and the weight of stairs. The quiet was almost jarring after the hum of the reception. My phone buzzed again, this time it was a message from my father. "Come to the study. Now." I knew that tone. It was the one he used when he was in the middle of negotiating something delicate. The study was on the far side of the estate, tucked away from the noise. When I stepped inside, my father was already there, seated in one of the leather chairs with a tumbler of brandy in his hand. Across from him sat two board members from our company, both of them looking unusually serious. "Claire," my father said, gesturing for me to sit. "They've just read the article." I took the seat beside him, my posture steady. One of the board members, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Hawthorne, spoke first. "You've done us a service." Daniel had been circling our operations for months, making overtures about a strategic merger. We were divided on whether to entertain it. Now there's no question. I inclined my head slightly. I thought it best to end his reach before it began. Well, Mrs. Hawthorne said, her mouth curving into a rare smile, you've certainly done that. They stayed for another 15 minutes, discussing the fallout, before taking their leave. When they were gone, my father turned to me fully. I'm proud of you, he said simply. It was not something he said often, and hearing it now anchored me in a way I hadn't expected. But, he added, you need to be ready. Daniel isn't the type to disappear quietly. I know, I said, my voice even. But neither am I. I left the study feeling lighter, yet more aware of the storm that was still brewing. The day wasn't over, and Daniel wasn't done fighting. But now, for the first time in both my lives, I was in a position where he couldn't touch me, not without cutting himself to pieces in the process. The reception had thinned by the time I returned, but the tension in the room had only thickened. Daniel was no longer trying to charm his way through conversations, he had shifted into survival mode. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw locked, and he kept checking his phone between strained exchanges with whoever was still willing to speak to him. I could tell he'd been making calls, probably to his lawyer, maybe to the woman who had been waiting in the wings during my first life. But whatever responses he was getting, they weren't good. I saw it in the way his expression tightened with each glance at the screen. I moved through the space deliberately, making no effort to avoid him but also giving him no acknowledgement. The power in ignoring him was subtle, but I could feel it working. People noticed when I didn't flinch in his presence. People noticed when I didn't look away. Eventually, he crossed the floor toward me, determination in every step. He waited until we were just far enough from the remaining guests that our voices wouldn't carry. You think you've won? He said, low and cold. You've humiliated yourself in front of your family, your friends, and half the city. Do you think anyone will trust you after this? I didn't blink. I think they'll trust me more. I told the truth. And the truth doesn't need spin. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw something almost like uncertainty flicker there. You've just made an enemy you can't afford, he said. I can still make calls. I can still ruin you. I let a slow smile curve my lips. You already tried that once. I'm still here. This time, I'm ready. He leaned in slightly, like proximity could make his threat sharper. You'll regret this. I didn't step back. No, I said quietly. You will. For a heartbeat, we just stood there, staring each other down. Then he straightened, scoffed under his breath, and walked away. I watched him go, each step he took feeling less certain than the last. That was the thing about Daniel, he thrived when people believed his version of events. But now, with the truth public and undeniable, he was running out of places to hide. The rest of the night passed in a blur of polite goodbyes and lingering stares. When the final guests had left, I found myself alone in the garden, the air cool against my skin. The flowers that had been arranged for the wedding glowed faintly under the string lights, their beauty almost mocking in its perfection. I thought about my first life. How I had stood in this same garden after the reception, my gown heavy with the weight of disappointment, my mind a storm of unanswered questions. Tonight, there were no unanswered questions. Only the certainty that I had taken back what was mine, and that Daniel had nothing left to take from me. At least, not if I kept my guard up. And I would. Because this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the first time I was the one writing it. The estate was quiet once the last car pulled away from the driveway, leaving only the faint rustle of the garden's leaves and the distant hum of the city beyond the gates. I stood at the French doors overlooking the reception lawn, still lit from the abandoned party. The tables sat untouched, their white linens pristine, crystal glasses sparkling under the lights as if mocking the chaos that had unfolded hours earlier. This was supposed to have been Daniel's stage. A perfect backdrop for his image of success. Now it was just an empty set after the lead actor had been booed off. I stepped outside, letting the cool night air settle over me. My gown trailed across the flagstone path, the fabric whispering with each step. In my first life, I had spent the same hour sitting in the bridal suite, replaying Daniel's public betrayal again and again until the words felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Tonight, I replayed something else. His expression when I walked away from the altar. The faint crack in his perfect mask, the moment he realized he'd lost control. I let that memory warm me more than the champagne ever could. My phone buzzed. It was Ellen again. Half the city's talking about it. He's already trending. Some of his investors are issuing statements. It's not good for him. I allowed myself a quiet smile. Good, I replied. Let them know the fall's only just started. She sent back a single thumbs up emoji, and I could almost hear the satisfaction in it. I slipped the phone into my clutch and wandered further into the garden, needing a moment to breathe away from the house. That was when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn right away. I knew the cadence, measured but heavy, the sound of someone trying to mask his frustration. Daniel. Still here? I said without looking over my shoulder. I thought you'd be on the phone begging someone to clean up the mess. Funny, he said, his voice closer now. I thought you'd be packing to leave before the press shows up on your doorstep tomorrow morning. I finally turned to face him. His tie was gone, his shirt collar open, but there was nothing relaxed about him. His eyes were sharp, his mouth drawn tight. I'm not hiding, I said. Why would I? I'm not the one exposed. He took a step closer. You think you're safe because you embarrassed me in front of a few hundred people? You have no idea how fast I can turn this around. You've made yourself look unstable. Impulsive. And I still know things about you that the public would love to hear. I tilted my head slightly. And I still have every piece of evidence tying you to your fraud, your affairs, your sabotage. If you think I'm afraid of whatever you think you know about me, you've learned nothing. His jaw tightened. You've changed. No, I said, holding his gaze. I've just stopped letting you write my story. For a long moment, we stood there, the tension between us wound tight as wire. Finally, he gave a short, humorless laugh. You'll slip eventually. Everyone does. And when you do, I'll be there. The difference, I said softly, is that now I'll see you coming. He stared at me another beat before turning and walking back toward the house. I watched him go, the night swallowing his figure until he disappeared behind the glow of the windows. I stayed in the garden a while longer, letting the quiet settle over me. This was not the last time I'd see Daniel. He would circle back, try to claw his way out of the pit he'd fallen into, maybe even try to drag me down with him. But now I had the one thing he'd taken from me in my first life, time. Time to prepare, to plan, to turn every move he made into another trap of his own making. When I finally returned inside, the staff had begun clearing the tables. The champagne flutes clinked softly as they were collected, the only sound in the hollow room. I paused by the head table and rested my hand on the back of the chair that should have been mine. Not as Daniel's wife, but as the woman who ran the show. That was the role I intended to keep, not just for tonight, but for every chapter that came after. Tonight, I had walked away from the altar. Tomorrow, I would start building a life where Daniel Reed was nothing more than a cautionary tale. And for the first time, I could see that future clearly. The morning after was sharp with autumn air, the kind that made the sky seem cleaner than it had any right to be. I stood on the balcony outside my bedroom, a mug of coffee warming my hands, and listened to the muted bustle from the driveway below. News vans had gathered just beyond the gates, their long lenses glinting in the sunlight. Even from here, I could hear the faint crackle of reporters rehearsing their lines. In my first life, I would have been hiding behind drawn curtains, terrified of the noise, letting Daniel spin the narrative before I even found my voice. Not this time. I had woken before sunrise, showered, dressed in a fitted navy coat and boots, and let my hair fall loose over my shoulders. If they wanted an image, I'd give them one, calm, collected, untouchable. My phone buzzed on the balcony rail. A message from Ellen. It's spreading overseas now. Some outlets are digging into his old deals. A few names are coming forward who never spoke before. I typed back quickly, good. The deeper they dig, the less room he has to breathe. The truth was, I wasn't just thinking about Daniel anymore. I was thinking about the people he'd hurt in his climb, the ones who had been too afraid or too powerless to push back. My public break from him had given them something, a signal that it was safe to speak. And I intended to make that safety permanent. By mid-morning, I was seated in my father's study with him and two of our company's senior board members. Papers lay spread across the desk, the finalized trust documents, a new set of corporate resolutions, and a proposal I'd been drafting in secret since the moment I realized I'd been reborn. You want to expand the holding company's oversight, my father said, scanning the pages. This will cut off any avenue Daniel might have left to worm his way into our operations. Exactly, I said. And it also strengthens our alliances with the investors he was courting. If we give them reassurance now, they'll have no reason to entertain his offers later. One of the board members, a silver-haired man named Grant, looked up from the proposal. You've thought this through. I've lived it before, I said, letting the words hang there for a moment. They couldn't know how literally I meant them, but the conviction in my voice didn't need explanation. By the time the meeting ended, I had their full support. We set the motions in place that very afternoon. Every legal door Daniel had once pried open in my first life was now locked, bolted, and sealed. Just after lunch, a text from Jenna lit up my phone. He's calling people. Asking for meetings. No one's saying yes. I stared at the message for a long moment, picturing him pacing somewhere in that penthouse apartment of his, dialing number after number, each rejection another thread pulled loose from his carefully woven image. Part of me wanted to feel satisfied. Another part knew this was just the first round. Daniel was too arrogant to stay quiet. He would regroup, tell himself he could salvage what was left, maybe even convince a few desperate or foolish allies to stand with him. But I was ready for that. In my first life, I had reacted to his moves like a pawn being shoved around a board. Now, I was building my own strategy, several moves ahead. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the news vans finally dispersed, I walked back into the garden where it had all started yesterday. The chairs were gone, the flowers already wilting in the crisp air, the aisle stripped bare. It looked nothing like the wedding I'd once dreamed of, and yet it felt more perfect than anything I'd ever planned. Because this space, empty and quiet, represented something I had never truly held before, my freedom. I stood at the end of the aisle for a long time, hands in my coat pockets, and let myself imagine what came next, not the constant defense against Daniel's games, but the pursuit of something bigger. My life, on my terms. My company, without compromise. My story, told by no one but me. Daniel Reed had been my downfall once. Now, he was just the first step in the life I was finally ready to live. And this time I would make sure no one, not him, not anyone, could take it from me.